I'm thrilled to introduce Professor Greg Durrett, member of UT Austin's Designing Responsible AI Technologies to Curb Disinformation project. Greg's an assistant professor in computer science, and his current research covers a range of topics in statistical natural language processing, including co-reference resolution, entity linking, document summarization, and question answering. So I'll turn it over to Greg Durrett now.
All right, great. Thanks so much. So I'm really happy here to be hosting a panel with, I guess, David, who we just heard from, and we'll also be joined by Scott Hale and Shalini Joshi. So let me first kind of set the stage, I guess, for this discussion, which I think really emerges from David's remarks. So, I mean, the perspective that I'm coming from, which is really the natural language processing community, I think has seen a lot of improvements in technology over the last few years, and particularly in the last 5 years with the rise of big neural network models, some of which David talked about. But we've also seen a lot of sort of techno-solutionism of trying to take these models and then apply them to various problems where they may be able to kind of work or not work in some of those settings, but sometimes those problems aren't always aligned with basically what the kind of real boots on the ground folks who are working on fact checking need. So that's, I think, what we're going to try to get some insight from in this panel today. So I guess let me briefly introduce the other two panelists, and then I will let them kind of in their own words say a little bit more about who they are and what they do. So first, we have Dr. Scott Hale, who is a associate professor and senior research fellow at the Oxford Internet Institute and a fellow of the Alan Turing Institute. And so let Scott, if he's here, can turn, yeah, there you are. Maybe give a kind of brief introduction of,
Thank you, Greg. Yeah, great to be here. So my own background is also in NLP, but I guess I got a bit disillusioned at points and went off thinking, well, gee, how are people actually using technologies, and you know, where are they making an impact in the real world? And so I started doing a lot more human-computer interaction and moving much more to the applied side. So a lot of my research now focuses on increasing equitable access to quality information. And part of that is sort of online harms, hate speech identification, things of that nature, but also misinformation. And so in addition to my role at Oxford and the Alan Turing Institute, which is our national center in the UK for data science, I'm also director of research at Medan, a technology nonprofit that's building tools for fact checkers and journalists. And so I have this sort of split role where I am very much an academic, but also, you know, working day to day with fact-checking organizations and practitioners. And I think one of the things that I'll want to pick up on in the panel, and I know we have some planned questions, we'll be very excited about audience questions, but is to, you know, sort of pick up on some of the differences and challenges and the mismatch maybe between what we maybe see as, oh, this is the latest, greatest problem that we ought to be addressing in academia, and what the actual day-to-day needs are that fact checkers have. So I can pause there, but I'll be able to say a lot more as we get going with the panel. So thank you.
All right, thanks so much. And yeah, now let me introduce Shalini, who is a program director for Asia Pacific at Medan. And she's involved in expanding Medan's work in the Asia Pacific region. Specifically, she's also the co-founder of Khabar Lahariya, India's only independent digital news network available to viewers in remote rural areas and small towns. So let me turn it over to her to say a little bit more about her work.
Thank you, Greg. It's an honor to be here. I work with Medan, and as Scott introduced Medan, previously, we build tools, we build software, we design programmatic interventions, and we also conduct research to address the global misinformation crisis and also other digital threats. At Medan, I work closely with fact checkers, with newsrooms and academics that are involved in addressing misinformation. And as someone who has worked closely with fact checkers and also with journalists, I understand that fact checkers have a variety of needs. Based on what David was saying earlier, there is a need to provide different kinds of solutions to help fact checkers respond to misinformation. And one of the things that we do at Midan is to help fact checkers address misinformation circulating in closed messaging apps. That's something that I'm going to talk about today. The ways in which fact checkers are addressing misinformation and disinformation on messaging apps like WhatsApp, which is very popular in India, where I'm based, but also in countries like Brazil and Mexico, where we've been working very actively. Messaging apps like Viber, which is very popular in the Philippines, or also other messaging platforms. So what are some of the solutions that can help fact checkers respond to misinformation at scale? What are the solutions that can help them make their workflows more efficient, to detect content patterns based on variations of same claims? And David did talk about claim matching, which we will talk about more in this panel. So at Midan, we strive to design such solutions for fact checkers through our software, which is called Check. And also our programs that involve training, designing workflows, seeking a lot of feedback, and finally, also our research that generates new insights for fact checkers and academics and people who are trying to improve the quality of online information.
Great, thanks. So I think again, as kind of one of the themes of this session, I think we're really looking for how, what kinds of tools are out there that can be useful. How can we better meet the needs of folks doing real fact checking? So maybe let me dive in kind of on that question, which I guess David also sort of touched on in his talk. But really, if we want to think about kind of in the fact checking pipelines that you're working with, what are maybe, let's say kind of concretely between like 1 and 3 tools or places where either current things are really helpful or, something that doesn't exist would be really helpful that you can see? Maybe we'll start with Scott and then Shalini, and then David, we'll let you kind of add to things that they're saying about that.
Yeah, we can bounce around, definitely. So, I mean, I think David hit on one key point, Rich, right, which is what to fact check. Now, I would say, again, there's a sort of sometimes disconnect between academics and practitioners on this point. There are academic work that's trying to say, oh, well, we'll determine fully whether a claim is check-worthy or not. And then when you talk to fact checkers, they say, well, actually, look, it depends a lot on editorial priorities, maybe what we're involved in, in other factors, and it's not so black and white. And so, just as an example, things that maybe can help make that decision for a fact checker, but don't necessarily make it, in the end, it gives the input to the fact checker. So we do a lot of work on prevalence. If we can do the claim matching well, we can give an idea whether, a claim is being seen by tens of people, hundreds of people, or thousands of people, right? And the other thing we work a lot on, or a current example at least, is categorization. We have, I think, 5 fact-checking organizations at the moment that are all cooperating together, fact-checking around the Brazilian elections, which had a runoff and it's coming up this weekend. And since they're very focused on the elections, one of the things that we can actually do that's helpful is simply identify whether claims are about the elections or not. And this is sort of an independent access about how prevalent or not they are, or what type of claim it is, etc. But if we can say, oh, these are things about the election, right now, that's an editorial priority for these fact-checking organizations. And so that can help, they can bring those to the fore, and maybe they look first at those before looking on to non-election related claims, for instance. And so I think that's one thing that, just that we're doing at the moment, that I've gotten some good positive feedback on. And it seems like being able to better sort claims and categorize them can be helpful in that prioritization point. Of course, we're doing it in Portuguese, and in this particular setting, the challenge comes, of course, as David was also alluding to, how do you scale that across languages, across political contexts? What's election related in Brazil might be different than what's election related in India or the US, etc.
I also want to talk about elections, since Scott touched on that, and to look at the work of fact checkers during events like elections. So we've seen in the past when we worked on election-related projects in different countries that include India, Brazil, Kenya, and the Philippines most recently, that there is a lot of misinformation that fact checkers see during and also before and after elections. There are hundreds of messages sometimes that fact checkers receive, and a lot of fact checking groups have teams that are small, have resources that are limited. And a challenge for all fact checking groups is to engage with their audiences, sending those messages, respond to those messages at scale, to also design editorial workflows that can help them prioritize some of the messages that are coming in, and also then distribute the fact checks. So I think the tools that we are trying to build at Midan are trying to respond to some of these issues of fact checkers trying to address misinformation around elections, around the health crisis, like we saw most recently during the COVID pandemic in 2020 and 21, and even this year. And also around other events, like if there's a natural disaster or a protest happening. So some of the features that would help fact checkers is to be able to engage with audiences and engage maybe in local languages, have local content available, to collect the claims, to prioritize the claims, to annotate the claims that are coming in, and then to also distribute the responses that they are designing. And finally, for also fact checkers to be able to collaborate during such periods is really important. So during an election, we've seen that there have been coalitions of fact checkers who've come together. How do fact checkers then collaborate? What is the tool available to these groups? And again, we're trying to work on features that enable fact checkers and even civil society groups and researchers to collaborate during these large events.
Thanks, David. Do you want to add anything to that, beyond what you've said before about the tools?
Yeah, I thought as I talk about both elections and also how to choose what is worth checking. Just one example, really, that for that was involved in a couple of years ago now. We collaborated closely with Africa Check, based in Southern Africa, and when they had a national election there, they shared with us the manifestos of some main parties in the run-up to the election. And one thing we could do then was run those through our pipeline and annotate them. Basically, we sent back a spreadsheet of all the claims in every manifesto, tagged up with what type of claim it was. Was it a quantitative claim, a prediction, and so on? And the point was that they could then, the fact checkers could then just filter out and temporarily ignore all the predictions as being basically uncheckable, and all sort of general statements and personal beliefs, and zoom in on things which actually could potentially be checkable. And one particular case, they found a claim made about the amount of water being wasted in some particular region in South Africa, which is a big political issue, and the figure was totally wrong. And it seemed extraordinary. And so the concept of the party published the manifesto and said, where did this number come from? And they quickly said, oh, actually, we got it wrong. We quoted like a monthly figure as if it was an annual figure, or other way around perhaps. and they actually managed to publish a correction to their manifesto. And yeah, I think it's an example where fact checkers can, by finding things worth checking, can actually have an impact on an election before the event happens. And we don't know how much effect they had, but I like to think that somebody somewhere might have seen the manifesto correction and said, oh, okay, I'll vote this way, not that way. And that's kind of genuine impact from fact checking.
Yeah, so I guess one theme I think we're kind of hearing is this sort of, I guess, I like the publish and act terminology, David, that you used. And I think, Shalini, you were talking about kind of distributing the, fact check and, trying to, I think, penetrate these kind of, groups on things like WhatsApp and sort of spread the kind of correct information there. So I guess one, obviously, like there's a lot of discussion around tools for figuring out what to check and how to go about doing that and gathering the information. What do you think is kind of the current sort of directions in terms of this act phase? Like, is there some way that is there some way that technology can help either distribute this stuff more widely, or yeah, I don't know. It's a very vague question, but let me open it to the floor.
I mean, I suppose one thing, just picking up on distribution, and this I know came up in the questions as well, is essentially, okay, if a lot of labor goes into producing a human-led fact check, we do want to make sure that that gets sort of associated and easily found with all the content that it applies to, as much as possible. And so again, the sort of claim matching work across languages, across different context platforms. There's real challenges from an NLP perspective, often in the different language styles of language that are used in either different platforms or more formally by journalists versus social media content, etc. But if we can start better associating fact checks with the content that they apply to, across the web, across languages, I think that's one way to get more awareness out there about the fact checks and corrections to misinformation that, oftentimes is spreading unintentionally. I think the act portion is harder in many instances. But this is a real strength that Full Fact has to sort of ask and get these sort of corrections to the record, etc. I haven't thought as much about where we can assist with that, but I think one aspect that does come to mind is, again, sort of some of my backgrounds in collective action work with political scientists. And so thinking, okay, well, in what ways could advertisers or others that are essentially supporting the online information system, consumers can play a big role in sort of getting messages through to platforms, by through their advertisers or others, and that might be one way that we sort of demand more action be taken, more care be taken by platforms.
Yeah, I'll just make a quick point about Full Fact, and I'll be quick because there's not really much technology, but a lot of the work we do in this area is human involvement. So, for example, there's a weird oddity that currently, if a government minister makes a mistake in Parliament, they can correct the record. They can actually literally get the Parliament's record rewritten with the correct information. But if you're a backbencher, or you're outside the government or in the opposition, there is no mechanism to record your correction. So even if an MP wants to admit they made a mistake and want to correct the record, currently they can't do it. They can tweet about it, but they can't get the official record corrected. And so actually the chief executive of Full Fact, Will Moy, was recently in front of Parliament debating this and actually raised the point and said, look, please, can you change the rules so that we can have MPs correcting the record? It's kind of thing which isn't a technology at all, is a matter of political lobbying. We also talk to people like Facebook and other social platforms, asking them to improve the way they handle misinformation from our position of having done a lot of years of fact checking. And so I think a lot of this, it does come down to using technology where it's appropriate. And yes, we can do more of that, but some of the actions at least do require, it can be a phone call, it can be taking someone to lunch and saying, stop saying this thing, or it can be lobbying government, it can be lobbying large tech companies. And so, yeah, not everything has a technical solution.
I wanted to give the example of an initiative that we worked with earlier this year. This is Facts First PH, an initiative that Midan launched with Rappler in the Philippines. Rappler is an independent newsroom co-founded by Maria Ressa, who's, as we all know, Nobel Prize winner. So anticipating a rise in disinformation in the online space in the lead up to the Philippine general election, Rappler launched Facts First PH, and Midan partnered with Rappler and provided the technology that was used by fact checkers and newsrooms during this initiative. So the initiative had 140 plus groups, and these were groups from media, universities, civil society groups, researchers, and also lawyers. And the idea was that this initiative would have different layers. So there were the newsrooms and the fact-checking groups that were debunking online claims that they were receiving via tip lines on Facebook Messenger, on Viber, on Twitter. And these claims were pooled together in Midan's Check platform. And fact checkers were able to evaluate and verify and produce fact checks to claims that were verifiable. The second layer, which played a very important role in distributing the fact checks, was actually the civil society organizations. So while the news groups and fact-checking groups were responding directly to claims coming in through the messaging platforms, the civil society groups were amplifying some of these fact checks to a much wider audience. So they were translating the fact checks into other local languages and also distributing them in different formats. The research group and the researchers that were involved, which was the third layer of this initiative, they produce research studies and research papers on disinformation, on patterns that they were seeing during the elections, and also conducted weekly briefings during the period of the elections. And finally, the lawyers were taking action against people who were threatening the journalists or the civil society groups involved in the initiative. So just in terms of people coming together to address misinformation and disinformation, and also then distributing the fact checks and the content that was being produced in different ways. This was a good example of how a coalition actually worked during an election.
Great, thanks. Yeah, those are super interesting kind of case studies to hear about for this stuff. I wanted to move to one kind of point that came up in the first, I guess in the Q&A from David's talk, which was about kind of multimedia. We've talked a lot about tools for dealing with claims in language, and I think a lot of what David talked about was, more about kind of dealing with textual transcripts. But I wanted to ask a little bit about kind of where you, I guess, just sort of leaving it open-ended, where you see the state of the art in terms of dealing with things and kind of image memes or video or various kinds of multimedia like that. Scott, I'm going to pick on you. You were excited to get into this, so.
Sorry, I was answering one of the other questions as well, but this was about challenges with moving beyond text, right?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I mean, we've said a lot about claim matching. When it gets to other formats, of course, there's ways that things reduce down to text. So, where we see videos being flagged by a user to a fact-checking organization, for instance, we do text to speech, speech to text extraction. We extract text out of images as well, OCR. And I think that helps in a way, and you can start seeing these things. We also hash the images and the videos with what are known as perceptual hashes, so that even if there are small edits to an image, they end up still being linked together. Or quite related, is quite similar, and we can look up and say, okay, these are visually similar to each other. And so that's one of the ways that we start building things up. I actually answered earlier in the chat as well that I think one of the real challenges is that while we have some good databases of the published fact checks, things like Google's Fact Check Explorer, one of the things that we think we need to do better academic research is actually the original misinformation claims that are attached to each fact check. There actually will be some work coming out that I'm aware of, hopefully before the end of the year, as far as I know, from Duke on this Duke Reporters Lab. But I can't say more until that's public. But I think they're doing some excellent work there. Midan has also been working to try to think, how can we create better data sharing between fact-checking organizations and academics, but being very mindful of, I think, some of the challenges David was talking about earlier, that if you just open up all the data, it also invites nefarious uses by disinformation actors. You might be sort of like, oh, how is my disinformation campaign going? What has been flagged and what hasn't, and how could I alter something so that it doesn't get automatically matched to an existing fact check, et cetera. So there are, I think, real concerns about that, and we need to think ethically and responsibly how to share data. But I'm hopeful that we can do that. I think there's a lot of promise of multimodal architectures that can put image and text into a similar semantic space. Being able to extract things out of images or videos, doing object recognition, and being able to reconstruct some of the context that isn't entirely there when you just take a transcript of a video, I think are all areas that are super exciting and need more research.
Yes, to add to that a little bit, you mentioned the Fact Check Explorer. So Google basically promotes this schema called Claim Review, which lets fact checkers record their fact checked claims in a standard format, which then can be shared and scraped more easily. I think that there are at least talks to extend this to include multimedia examples, so including images, videos, and things within that metadata. But one risk of this, and also finding the original misinformation, one risk is that it makes basically requires more effort on part of the fact checkers to record this metadata, and there's always a risk that it gets so much so the effort required is so great that people stop using it entirely. So one project that I know Phil Fatt was involved in a couple of years ago now was creating a WordPress plugin to make it easier for fact checkers to add this claim review data to their fact checks, to make it easier for that information then to be found by the Google search engine. And that did increase the take up of claim review. I think, yes, it'd be great to have more and more data in there and make it richer and make it more powerful. I said we'd like that to happen. But yeah, we must also recognize that would help the technologists, but at the cost of requiring fact checkers to do more manual work in terms of tagging up the data in the first place. Their job is to write fact check articles. The fact that they can also tag data up in a way that we can use it is a bonus. But it's a challenge how to get that more efficiently done without requiring too much effort from the fact checkers.
Okay, thanks. So I guess one, to sort of shift gears a little bit, I mean, we've talked a bit about what tools are kind of, being used with y'all at your organizations. I'm curious about kind of where you see some of the mismatch, I guess, between what academic research is doing and what, your groups are doing. Like, is there some sort of, I guess, misalignment you'd like to call attention to, or something you'd like to comment on there? Shalini, I don't know if you want to start with this one. I think,
Yeah, I think there is a need for researchers and fact checkers to come together more often. There is a lot of research that's happening. But I think that there is a need for this research to respond directly to the challenges that fact checkers are facing. And I think the example that I gave of Facts First PH is a good one, where the two groups were working in a collaborative manner, trying to look at the issue of misinformation around an event, and also trying to do some analysis in a collective manner. So, I just say that again, that maybe, similar initiatives where researchers, fact checkers, journalists, academics come together. And there are such forums where work is happening. And I think that that's the way to go forward.
Yeah,
I can probably, please go on, David.
Yeah, thank you. I can tell you what Shalini was saying, that I think forums, even like this one, where I'm not a fact checker, but I sort of represent them very closely, as do the other guys. It's great to be able to speak to academics about what they actually do. One example I've come across recently is the emphasis over several years now of claim verification as being what fact checkers do, which I must admit I thought it was as well before I joined Full Fact. It's not just saying, is this claim true or false? There's a lot of emphasis from academics on there, various groups like Fever, creating very interesting problems and showing great, generating new ideas, new research. But it's not actually a very large part of what fact checkers actually do. It's not really what they want to help with. So yeah, I think that kind of problem can be dealt with to some extent by more forums, by more talking, including days like this. Sorry, Scott.
No, that's great. Yeah, and I mean, there is some good research. We shared, I think, the link to David's article earlier when they were talking to many fact checkers about the needs they have. And I would just say one thing is to engage with that research at a human-centered level, and we need more of that research happening. But what we don't need necessarily is every researcher showing up at their local fact checker's door saying, give me data, give me, I want to do research with their data, because of course fact checking organizations are super busy, and one of the it's sort of just as David was saying, extra work to take up more data. It's also like sometimes extra work to manage a lot of these collaborations. And so I think what we're trying to do, and I'm trying to think a lot about, is how can we basically create those sort of collaborations with less friction and less time demand from fact checkers as well. I think Meedan has a unique spot in being a nonprofit that is helping support fact checkers through software. And so we're thinking through what are some of the ways that we could make it very easy for a fact-checking organization to say, okay, here's data I'd be comfortable sharing with vetted academic researchers, put that onto a central website. A researcher could go there, say, hey, I'd like access for these reasons, and very quickly a fact-checking organization could say, oh yeah, thumbs up, here it is, and it's in a standardized format or things like that. So I think just the infrastructure to make it easier to have these collaborations in a way that they don't demand a lot of time and additional resources from what are often small organizations, really pushed already to their max, just doing the work that they're doing already, which is so important. I maybe just add two other things that I think from an academic standpoint we could think more about as well. The first is data. There are a number of these data sets that we often see recurring over and over again now in academic publications. And in a way that's good, because they allow us to sort of benchmark new systems against old ones and have a sort of good way to compare new research. But one of the real challenges in fact checking is the non-stationarity of the data. Things are constantly changing. And so if you're like, oh, I've gone back and I've gotten my COVID fact-checking set of claims from 2020, and I can do this now, and I can, find this evidence and support it, et cetera, it misses some of the point that, oh, well, actually some of that evidence wasn't there when the claim was first being made, or the model that you're actually using and fine-tuning wouldn't have been that model back in 2020. None of the language models had ever seen the word COVID in 2020. They'd never known that Delta was somehow related to coronavirus, was related to COVID, right? And now if you go with current language models that maybe have been trained on newer data, they know all these associations. And so one of the challenges, I think, is that we need to get better at actually saying, okay, how well can my tools perform on real world data that's constantly changing and up to date? So that's one aspect. And then the second one is metrics. We all love maximizing our F1 scores, essentially, right? Precision and recall, how well are we doing? And that's what gets you into the conferences. David cited an example earlier where low precision and unknown recall were actually still quite useful because it produced a feed that could quickly be digested and the few positive hits pulled out by a fact checker. Conversely, though, I would also share examples where high precision is really important and perhaps more important than recall. And in many instances, this is something I encounter when I work with fact-checking organizations when they're operating tip lines, say accounts on social media where users are directly interacting with them. It's their reputation on the line at the end of the day. And so if there's an incorrect match, user says, submits a piece of content and we say, oh, that's false, and here's the fact check, except it's actually not a good match, it's a bad match, and maybe what the user sent is actually a true claim, or something else that has a reputational risk, a reputational impact for the organization. And many of the organizations we work with are very focused on precision, and so we do a lot of work thinking, how do we tune for higher precision, and where is it that we need to bring, say, a fact checker into the loop to verify a match, or verify or reject a potential match before that would go back to the end user. So anyway, I'll leave it there. But yeah, better infrastructure, real world data, constantly changing, and sometimes different metrics are appropriate than just our typical F1 approach.
Thanks. Yeah, those are some really nice takeaways. One thing I wanted to come back to just briefly, actually, sorry, first of all, yeah, let me echo what was just put in the chat, which is that we're going to start with general audience Q&A in a minute. So I'm just going to ask one more question first, but if you want to be typing out your questions and looking at what's there and upvoting, that'd be great. So I think one thing you mentioned was the kind of, sometimes perverse incentives of especially academia to publish papers. And, I guess the question I wanted to ask, kind of extending this discussion a little bit, was is there some way you can think of that we can better incentive align between, getting sort of useful stuff out of academia, and I guess conversely, it sounded like there were some thoughts about platforms for very overworked fact checkers to maybe be able to engage with academics without having to do a ton of extra work on their time off. Yeah.
To me, the very short answer is just keep talking. I shared my email address earlier. Please do, any thoughts, comments, questions, whatever, do get in touch. It's hard. I don't have any sort of general solutions other than just making sure that through discussion that these, there is greater alignment, basically, to make sure that the academics who want to do the right thing are doing things which actually the fact checking group will find useful. So yeah, keep talking.
Yes, I would say the same. And I also want to say that there are forums, there are groups where fact checkers and researchers are coming together, and I think more of that is what is needed.
Yeah, I think it's been nailed on the head. We're not necessarily going to change how academics are judged by publications or impact factors and H indexes or whatever. But I think there probably are ways that we could better align. Open source code in open science in general is gaining traction in academia. I think it's an important area that will help with further engagement. Medan's software check that Shalini talked about earlier is all open source. And one of our goals, and one of my goals personally, is to try to make it much easier to write simple bots, simple plugins for that. And, saying if you can write a plugin to check, well, look, we have 50 organizations that are fact-checking organizations using the platform right away that could give feedback or potentially use that in practice. And so I think there is a great potential for impact, but there's some barriers to overcome because something just poorly documented opened on GitHub isn't the same as it actually being able to be used in practice, especially when nearly all of our fact-checking organizations are working in non-English content, for instance.
Great, thanks. So yeah, I guess we'll start taking questions from the general audience now. Maybe one that I'll just kind of quickly get out front here. In terms of suggesting resources, I think there have been a lot of kind of pointers to potential, ways of getting involved in forums and communities and papers and things like that. I guess maybe if, during the downtime, if y'all collect, if there's a few kind of salient links or things like that, and you want to share those in the chat, we can share them with the participants here. So let me ask one that came up, which was basically the role. What about considering either tracking or factoring in the role of influencers or influencer organizations like Urban Legend? I mean, there's a citation here to Wofford in September 2022 Wired. I'm not sure about that article or if y'all are familiar with it, but yeah, I think we can answer the broad question.
So is the question, should we be concerned about influencers spreading misinformation? Is that right?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, it sounds like for media and, kind of operating on these social platforms, influencers might be a big factor. And I guess for you as well, you talked a little bit about kind of contact touch points with journalists, but I don't know, do you see more of course? I mean, there's a whole range from journalists to kind of social media influencer and everything in between, right? So I guess what can we do about that vague question?
Yeah, I mean, from that perspective, I know there have been a few cases recently where we've been fact-checking sort of professional, I guess, conspiracy theorists who have often huge followings on YouTube and elsewhere, and where appropriate, we have also tried to, again, by taking action as well as publishing, trying to involve regulators where that's appropriate, or the tech platforms themselves. If we can point out this misinformation actually goes against your own terms and conditions, please can you take it down? Please can you take responsibility for your platform? Where that's an appropriate response. That can often help more than just us publishing another article about Joe Rogan, somebody mentioned, and others who are spreading misinformation very forcefully.
Yeah, I guess there's sort of two camps, right? There's influencers inadvertently forwarding on things and spreading misinfo, amplifying it that without knowing perhaps is false. And so one open research question, I don't have the answer to this one, but that I've been thinking about is, could we, are there possibilities of sort of identifying where an influencer might be likely to amplify a false claim that we know is circulating, and being able to proactively reach out and say, hey, you might see this in your feed, right? Often, influencers are consuming content from a certain subset of sources. So if you could say, oh, in general, we know there's a sort of pathway, things get here and then picked up there and amplified here. It might be that we could reach out to some of those nodes who are unintentionally amplifying things and sort of say, hey, be on the lookout. There's this false claim going around. And prevent some of that amplification. I think in other cases, as David was addressing, it's people who make a living off promoting false claims, and telling them something is false is not necessarily going to change their propensity to amplify it. And I think that's where exactly the types of solutions David was outlining are more appropriate.
Okay, thanks. I guess one kind of piece, sort of I guess I'm kind of riffing on a couple of questions that are here. So you mentioned that there's, these sort of different, people who are kind of unknowingly spreading misinformation and might like to be informed about it versus people that are doing it deliberately. I guess both from the perspective of social media like Midan or also from the more kind of journalistic perspective, do you, I guess what's the sort of range of responses you get from what your organizations do? Like, how do you see kind of people react to the kind of act phase of the, publish and act paradigm?
It varies enormously. I mean, we are fortunate to have a number of politicians who have, accidentally quoted misinformation and being corrected, and they say, "Oh, yeah, sorry, you got that wrong," and retweeting out the correct links, sometimes even to our articles. I think once we actually managed to get a former prime minister to actually correct the record in Parliament, and he publicly named us, which is great. Those who sort of have a professional interest in being controversial, irrespective of the truth, tend to ignore us, or occasionally threaten us with legal action, although I think so far we've remained unsued. So yeah, I think it is almost as you would expect. People who make genuine mistakes are very apologetic and have no problems with being corrected. I think indeed welcome it. Those who have a professional interest in exaggerated claims or misleading claims don't like being looked at by people like us. And the more annoyed they get, the more I think, yep, we're doing the right job then. So yeah, I think the feedback varies, but it's pretty much what you would expect. Oh, so one point I will come back to, as a charity, one question we often do get addressed is who funds us, which is all on our website, is all publicly available. And that does lead to questions like, oh, this person who comes to this party funded you, therefore you're biased, or Facebook funds you, therefore you're biased this way or that way, which is something we're aware of and we fight against it the whole time. Like I said in my talk in the Q&A earlier, we are very conscious to avoid political bias. And so again, we get as much criticism from the left as from the right in the UK, which again suggests we're doing kind of the right job. If everyone's annoyed with us from all sides, we'll carry on doing that.
I don't know if you want to add anything, Shalini, from partners' experience. Midan isn't a fact-checking organization itself. It supports many fact-checking organizations, and so I think in that way has a slightly different feel. But yeah, I think there tend to be exactly those sorts of reactions, and I do think one of the things that I'm concerned about, I mentioned I sort of do broadly, sort of increasing equitable access to quality information, which in my mind encompasses hate speech and other things, is also thinking about the sort of hate speech and trolling that many journalists and fact checkers receive. And so, trying to be is thoughtful and trying to prepare as much as we can to be able to identify instances of trolling or other things happening, and providing tools and support for fact checkers, journalists broadly. Rebecca Trumbull at George Washington University is just starting a program of research that's focused explicitly on building better tools for journalists. And I think this is a really important area.
I just want to add here that very often the partners that we work with, that's the fact checkers, have said that when they publish fact checks, people do appreciate those. Sometimes when it's influencers, politicians who have published misleading information, they do issue apologies, especially on social media platforms, on Twitter, etc. One challenge is that very often the misleading claim has gone so viral that the correction or the fact check to that is not often, the reach of that fact check is not as that much of the misleading claim. So how do you make fact checks scalable? How do you make them reach more people? That's also an issue that a lot of groups are now working on, increasing the life of a fact check, making it more shareable across platforms, across different formats, languages, etc. And some groups are doing excellent work on that.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for all your answers to those. So I think we'll kind of move now to closing remarks. So, in maybe just a minute or two, if each of you could share just a kind of either brief summary of what you'd like folks to take away from here, or a brief call to action of what you'd like our participants to kind of leave here with. And let's go, I guess let's do Scott, Shalini, David to close out in that order.
Cool. I didn't prepare particularly closing remarks. So just thinking through here as well. I mean, I think we've hit on a lot of ways that technology can assist human-led fact-checking, can help scale the impact of human-led fact-checking, etc. Of course, there is a lot of work in computer science also asking how can algorithms replace human fact-checking, and I won't say that that research isn't helpful at all, but I think what I would encourage is thinking about what are some of the components that plug into human-led fact-checking, because ultimately at the end of the day, adjudicating whether a claim is misleading or missing context. There was a question in the Q&A about sort of implied things by putting two true claims together and creating implications of something that might be false or misleading at that point. A lot of that still requires human judgment at the end of the day. And so I think, the big challenge I would leave the audience with is to think about the ways in which technology can empower and assist human fact checkers, and across all the platforms, contexts, languages that they're operating in. There's a lot of cultural knowledge, a lot of historic knowledge that goes into why certain claims are misleading or false in many instances. And so I think there's great opportunity for more collaboration, great impact through academics and practitioners working together. And I'm very excited to be in conversations like today where we're having some of that discussion.
I want to say something similar, which is that fact checkers sometimes have the best instincts, know-how and training to deal with complex topics, to also work at scale and work during challenging situations. And there is a need for people who are developing tools, whether it's engineers, product people, to work together to understand the needs of fact checkers and some of the challenges that they face, to develop tools that make the work of fact checkers more efficient, to help them engage with their audiences, because most newsrooms and fact checking groups do want to build a community and engage with people who are sending claims to them. And finally, for research, there is so much of research that's happening, and there is still a lot that needs to be done. So for groups to come together is something that will definitely help address the problem of misinformation and disinformation. So fact checkers, researchers, developers, product people coming together to look at the challenges and find solutions.
Yeah, I made a couple of very brief points. I want us to go back to the beginning and say that bad information ruins lives. The reason we're all trying to do fact-checking or to improve fact-checking is because misinformation does harm communities and spreads hate, and it undermines democracy and leads to bad decisions. And so it's really important that we all do try to improve the quality of public debate and public information. I think the tools that I was presenting my talk earlier and we've been discussing since then are trying to do the right thing, but none of them, to be honest, none of them are great. They all need to be improved. And so there's a huge scope there, I think, for collaboration with researchers, with developers of all kinds, across the whole board of all these different problems that we've been discussing. There's huge scope for collaboration, huge scope to improve the data sets, the models, the algorithms, the interfaces, everything. And so, yeah, please do talk to us. Please talk to other fact checkers, other organizations, and figure out how you can help make this problem a bit better.
All right, well, thank you so much for your participation in the panel today, all three of you, David, Scott, and Shalini. This has been a really fascinating conversation, and I know I've learned a ton from it. So thank you all. Let me turn it back over now to Durrett for the second panel.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Greg, and thank you to all the panelists. It was a wonderful panel that had a lot of engaging topics, and thank you to the audience for your Q&A into the Zoom tool.